Hi guys, today we're going to start talking about cladograms, which you could also call phylogenetic trees, and they look like this picture down here. And this is kind of like a family tree. Like your family tree shows how you're related to all the people in your family, like your grandparents and your cousins and your brothers and sisters. And a cladogram shows us how other species are related to each other. And it also helps us when we're figuring out how species have evolved over time. And evolution is when the traits change over time in a population, right? So this kind of helps us see that, and it helps us see how they are related to each other. They can be kind of tricky to read if you haven't done it before, so let's do a little bit of practice. Here I've got a cladogram. And the first question I want to talk to you about is which organisms have opposable thumbs? Opposable thumbs just means like that they can move their thumb like you and I can, right? So we've got opposable thumbs right here on our cladogram. And the way we read this is any organisms that are above that trait are going to have that trait. So the only organism in this case that could have opposable thumbs would be the chimpanzee. Everything else is below it. All these animals are below it, and they would not have opposable thumbs. It would just be the chimpanzee that would have it in this case. The next question is which organisms have claws or nails? So we're going to look in our phylogenetic tree again and find that trait, claws or nails, right there. And then remember, we're going to see which organisms are above it in the tree. So I'm going to go ahead and draw an arrow upwards. And obviously the chimpanzee is above it. Also, the hamster is above it. And the lizard. So all three of those organisms have claws or nails. However, we know the salamander and the salmon do not have claws or nails because those two animals are below that trait, so we know that they can't have it. It would just be these three because they're above it. Whoops. Okay. And then the last one I want to talk to you about with this picture is which organisms do not have lungs. So let's look at our cladogram again and find where it says lungs right there. And the ones that do have lungs are going to be the ones above it. So I'm going to draw my arrow up again. We know that the chimpanzee has lungs. We know that the hamster has lungs. And the lizard has lungs, and so does the salamander. But notice the question says which organisms do not have lungs. So the answer to that would just be one organism. The salmon is the only one that doesn't have lungs because all of the four that are above it do have lungs, right? So the answer to the last one would be the salmon is the only one that doesn't have lungs. Okay. I'm going to show you another example of a cladogram, and we're going to talk about a couple of other questions too. Sometimes they look like this instead. Like the last one that we saw had kind of like a V shape, but sometimes the branches look more like this, like more square. It means the same thing. It's just that sometimes they draw them differently. So let's look at this first question. It says, which organism is most closely related to the rodents and rabbits? So first, I'm going to look at my cladogram and find rodents and rabbits. And I can see them right there. And I'm wondering which organism is most closely related. So remember, a cladogram is kind of like a family tree, and it shows us how these organisms are related to each other. So if I was to ask my students this, they probably would guess either the primates or the crocodiles because those are the two organisms that are right next to the rodents and rabbits. And that's a pretty good guess. That's pretty intuitive. But only one of these is correct. If you start at rodents and rabbits and trace it back, we can get to the primates pretty quickly. Now, if we try to trace rodents and rabbits back to crocodiles, that was a much longer path that I had to trace. So since we can get to the primates so quickly by tracing that path backwards, we know that the primates are actually more closely related to rodents and rabbits than crocodiles are. Another way that we know that is because rodents and rabbits are on the same branch as primates. And since they're on the same branch, they're probably more closely related. You can see here, they both have hair. So they share a trait that rodents and rabbits don't share with anything else. So the rodents and rabbits are most closely related to the primates because if you trace it back, it's a pretty short path. Let's look at the next question. it says, which organism is most closely related to the crocodiles? So first I'm going to look at my cladogram and find where it says crocodiles. And I need to find which organism is most closely related. Again, my students usually say one of the two organisms that are next to the crocodiles, and that's a good guess, but we need to figure out which one specifically. Now notice the dinosaurs and birds are on the same branch as the crocodiles. And if I trace crocodiles back to dinosaurs and birds, that's a short trip. Now if I trace crocodiles back to rodents and rabbits, that's a much longer trip. They're not as closely related. So we know dinosaurs and birds would be the most closely related to the crocodiles. Okay, let's see what we have next. Where is the common ancestor of crocodiles and dinosaurs and birds? So I'm going to look at my cladogram, circle crocodiles, and the other thing it said is dinosaurs and birds. So I'm also going to circle dinosaurs and birds. Now the way to find the common ancestor is to trace the path backwards and find where it meets. So I'm going to start tracing the crocodile path backwards. And I'm also going to start tracing the dinosaurs and birds path backwards. And you can see that right here is where those two paths meet when I trace them back. That would be the most recent common ancestor of both crocodiles and dinosaurs and birds. What that means is there was some type of organism that lived then, and then one time, I would say one day, but probably not in a day, probably within a space of like a couple years, they started to separate. So part of that group of animals started to get different traits, and the other part of that group of animals got some different traits than that through natural selection. And over time, they evolved through natural selection to become pretty different. And so they used to be the same animal. They had a common ancestor. Then that common ancestor kind of split into two different groups. One group became crocodiles, and the other group became dinosaurs and birds. So right there where I drew that circle like 1,000 times, that would be the most recent common ancestor. Let's do one more practice of that because that's kind of tricky. So let's find the most recent common ancestor of amphibians and dinosaurs and birds because they're kind of less closely related. So I'm going to trace back the path backwards from amphibians, and then I'm going to trace the path backwards from dinosaurs and birds. And right here is where those two paths meet. So that would be the most recent common ancestor of amphibians and dinosaurs and birds. You can see since they are less closely related, their most recent common ancestor is farther back than the other one that we looked at, right? So what this means is there was this population of animals in the past, a long time ago, and then one time, like within probably a bigger space of time than a day. I was going to say one day, but probably a big space of time. They split into two groups, and one of those groups became the amphibians, and another of those groups split off and actually ended up splitting off again and again to become even more groups of animals. So this is the most recent common ancestor of those animals. And the last question we're going to look at is what are all the traits that primates have? So I'm going to start that by looking at my cladogram and finding primates. So here's primates. And then I'm going to trace the path backwards. I'm going to try and get to the beginning over here. So I'm going to start tracing backwards. I'm going to cross hair, cross amniotic egg. I'm not going to go this way. See how I went up to the amphibians? I'm not going to go that way because that's not backwards to this beginning part, okay? So I'm going to start over. I'm not going to go to the amphibians. I'm going to keep going backwards, backwards, backwards until I get to here. Now, after I trace that path backwards, any trait that I passed through when I was tracing that path, that would be a trait that the primates have. So we know that primates have hair because I crossed that trait. We know they have an amniotic egg. We know that they have 4 limbs, a bony skeleton, and vertebrae. But we know they don't have the 2 post-orbital fenestrae because I didn't cross that trait. So they would just have the traits that I crossed when I traced that path backwards to the beginning of my cladogram. So hopefully that was helpful and hopefully that made sense. If not, please send your teacher an email or go to one of the reviews and we can help you make some more sense of it. Also, we have some assignments this week that are going to help us understand cladograms and get some more practice with them. So good luck.